Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you know you can take the Lunch Hour with you wherever you go on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find our audio files. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can always check out what's happening in studio by checking out our YouTube channel for the Federal Newswire, which, by the way, you'll also see the other podcasts the Federal Newswire puts out, the China Desk and the Business of America. All good stuff you're going to want to take a look at. Very excited to bring our guest on today. His name is Joe Allen. He is a prominent figure in the field of technology transfer and intellectual property policy. He currently serves as the executive director of the Bayh-Dole Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and celebrating the landmark piece of legislation, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which is what we're going to be talking about. He's got a storied career in public policy. It began when he served as a professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee under the tutelage of Senator Birch Bayh, who is a Democrat from Indiana. In this role, he was instrumental in the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which has been hailed by the Economist Technology Quarterly as possibly, I wouldn't even say possibly, but the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in America over the last half century. Following his time in the Senate, he served in a number of major positions, executive director of the Intellectual Property Owners, Inc., where he contributed to the creation of the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. He served as director of the Office of Technology Commercialization at the U.S. Department of Commerce, among a whole host of things that we're going to get into. He continues to write. He continues to speak out. And the vital work that the Bayh-Dole Act is doing. And Joe and I finally met. We met over email a few months ago when we had our conversation here on the Lunch Hour with David Kapos. But finally got to meet Joe a couple of weeks ago in D.C. and wanted to have him on. His colleague, Kate Hudson, will also be joining us soon, or so we hope. We're working on those dates right now. But Joe, you told an incredibly compelling story. And so let's all set our Wayback Machine back to 1979, 1980, the state of America on the global stage, coming out of the 1970s into the go-go 80s. Well, the go-go 80s weren't looking like they were going to be so go-go. You got a briefing from the CIA when you were a Senate staffer. Talk about that, and also talk about how you wound up on Capitol Hill in the early 1980s.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed meeting you a couple weeks ago and looking forward to our conversation. Basically, I was a young Senate staffer, and we sort of stumbled on this issue. But in a nutshell, after World War II, the U.S. government had a policy of giving away any invention that was made with government funding. And it was like a Marshall Act of technology. We didn't have any international rivals. We thought that would be a nice thing to do, that if you let everybody use it for free, that it would benefit humanity. What we found was that the problem was the government's not is funding inventions, but it's not developing them. So you have to get somebody in the private sector to actually put their time and money into it, and that's a highly risky thing to do. So what happened was when we came along the scenes, it was like 30 years later, and you had the best minds in our public and private sector segregated. So at that time, we did have international competition. The Japanese and the Germans were eating our lunches. And that's when I actually live in Ohio, the place that was the industrial might of the World War II was then called the Rust Belt. So we were minding our own business. And at that time, we had double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment. So if you think things are bad now, they were much worse then. And as you mentioned, we had a briefing from the CIA, and they were looking at the 10 fields of technology for the future. And of those 10, we'd already lost our lead to 3, to Japan and Germany. Wow. And the forecast was we're going to lose 5 more in any minute because, they were aggressive about it, and we were just kind of piddling along. So Senator Bayh, who I work with, and Senator Bob Dole, who was a conservative Republican, this is in an election year, very much like the election year right now. It was very contentious. Bayh and Dole were on different teams. Bayh was running for re-election. Dole was hoping the Republicans were going to take over the Senate. But on this issue, they said, this makes no sense. We can't give away billions of dollars of government-funded technology and not getting anything back. So we actually had the Comptroller General did a study for us, And we were shocked to find out that not a single new drug had ever been developed under those policies from the National Institutes of Health funding, which is, again, leading one of the world's best, probably the world's best single source of innovation in life sciences. But again, the reason was very simple. No company was going to put their time and money into trying to develop something, particularly high risk, if a copier can just sit on the sidelines and wait till you show you're successful and then come in and do the same thing. So the Bayh-Dole Act changed all that. And what it did was it decentralized technology management from the Washington bureaucracy to people making inventions with government funding. It said that universities and small companies can own the inventions they make. The government can use them for its own purposes, which is mainly procurement or doing more research. But we actually injected the incentives of the patent system into government-funded research. And as you said, the economists really lauded that. That was one of the three changes we made at the same time that ignited the greatest renaissance of innovation in human history. And that's not an exaggeration. We are still in that now. But unfortunately, we have people, trying to undermine the pillars of what made us successful. We've been down this road before, but now it's like 45 years later, and unfortunately, some people have to relearn the same lesson.
Yeah, well, listen, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, as they say. It actually reminds me of an adage. My father and I go back and forth about this, which is I used to say the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. And my dad simplified it for me. He said, Andrew, there are many roads to utopia. However, all must traverse the surface of the earth. And that's really what we were talking about, right? There was this intention out there that, we're going to do this. You get government money to develop these things. We're going to give it to the world. But that's not the way the real world works, is it?
No. And I'll give you another saying. Those who control the past control the future. We have people that want to return us to the same failed policies. They think this time they're going to work better. So they are very busily rewriting the history of Bayh-Dole. And I was alive. I was there. And I know that it's not true, but they have a different narrative which they're pushing now. And that's one of the things that's being used to try to undermine the Bayh-Dole Act, which would be catastrophic. But they haven't learned a thing. What they've learned is you just erase what you don't like and write it over again.
Well, we're going to get into that in a second because I don't want to get too far ahead of it because I want to talk about, let's talk about the things that have been developed and the fact that Bayh-Dole doesn't just deal with pharmaceuticals, but it deals with a whole host of technologies. Talk about that. Talk about the successes. And I think you may have said this, maybe you didn't, but the fact is not only did we not lose any more of those technologies, we gained on those 10 categories, we gained those 3 back, didn't we?
Yes. In fact, a follow-up study found not only did we not lose those other 5, we regained our lead in all 10. And the reason for that was when you put our public and private sectors together, we can take on anybody. And the other thing we should mention is under the Bayh-Dole system, it's the industry people that take the risk. They are taking a huge risk, and the odds are that any particular technology is not going to pan out. But entrepreneurs are willing to do that if, in fact, they can protect their investment. And if they're successful, go ahead. If they fail, no one feels sorry for them. But just to give you an example, we had a couple kids at Stanford who came up with a new search engine using National Science Foundation funding. So Stanford tried it under Bayh-Dole. Stanford tried to license it. They put it out there. No one wanted it. There's already search engines out there. So the two kids came into Stanford, said, hey, we'd like to start a company. So Stanford said, yeah, why not? It's not going anywhere else. That turned into Google. Now, again, that doesn't mean that any kid in a dorm, in school is going to start a Google, but they did. Honeycrisp apples came out of Bayh-Dole. So the Bayh-Dole implications are, across the board. We've had water purifiers. The Bayh-Dole Coalition just recognized 5 people that we thought embody what makes Bayh-Dole successful. One of them came up with a water purifier that's helping people in the third world that have to drink polluted water. And he was first going to give it away. He said, I'll let anybody use it because, we want to make sure it gets out there. And some wise people at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory said, if you just give it away, no one will ever use it. He says, the people you want to use it don't have access to any of the things they need to make it. So he patented it. Then they tried to license it. And no company was interested because it's a small market. So he started his own company. So if you look at what drives U.S. innovation under Bayh-Dole, 70% of these inventions, even drugs, are licensed to small companies initially who are willing to take risks that big companies can't do. And we're the only country in the world whose economy and innovation is driven by small companies.
Right. And it gets into this idea of if there's no value attached to it, nobody will see it having value. Right. It's the old idea of, if you want people to actually show up for an event, don't make the tickets free of charge, but you charge somebody a nominal fee so that they see value. There's a psychological element to this. And of course, we have to be, we have to say, setting aside everything else, if you talk to most environmental scientists, they'll tell you that access to clean water is the most pressing environmental issue facing the planet. And so the idea that Bayh-Dole has played an instrumental role in this, I think, speaks volumes to the importance of the law. I'm sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Well, listen, you're exactly right. And that's what we want people to understand is literally people's lives depend on this. Some things are good to have, but we're really talking about the U.S. government and universities, our federal laboratories, are really great at coming up with breakthrough ideas. Right. Because there are things that companies can't, again, basic research companies don't do. It's too risky. But the problem is those things take a lot of time and effort. We actually had one of our scientists has a new vaccine, which is going to revolutionize the treatment of cattle. He grew up in Bangladesh. He saw a lot of suffering there, not just from people, but animals, where people would just lose their whole herds and the animals are suffering greatly. He came up with a new way of making vaccines, and it took him 20 years, 20 years of his own life, because it was so revolutionary, no company was interested. He finally found a small company in South Dakota, but it's because of the incentives. And I asked him, why didn't you give up? He said, it's a passion. It's a burn. He said, I couldn't get this out of my head. He said, I had to do this. I had to do it. And that's what really drives American innovation.
Without a doubt. And, as I'm fond of saying, the American dream is the entrepreneur's dream. You have an idea and you have the ability to make it real. And Bayh-Dole certainly helps with that. So now let's get into this issue of the immediate. I'm not going to say the immediate attacks, because Bayh-Dole existed as Bayh-Dole for almost a full 20 years. From 1980 until 1999, you got Bayh-Dole, and you have this explosion in innovation. You have the computer, the microchip era in the United States. You have an explosion of medical innovation, and I mean explosion in a good way, by the way. And then in 1999, a pair of folks decides they're going to tilt at this Bayh-Dole windmill. They want to see substantial change to Bayh-Dole, and a law review article gets published which says, I'm sorry, because we're putting the cart ahead of the horse. Bayh-Dole, you get the license, you're able to produce it. The federal government retains the right to march in very specific circumstances. Joe, let's talk about those circumstances and talk about how many times those circumstances have been used.
Yeah. Well, again, if you go back to, remember, in 1980, the government was, before Bayh-Dole, the policy was if you made any invention with any small part of federal funding, the invention was taken away from you. So most universities didn't own any inventions because of those policies. Now, they became so inept that basically the government said, okay, on a case-by-case basis, you can petition to the government and see if, out of our goodness for heart, we'll let you own the invention. And that was actually starting to work. But the Carter administration pulled the plug on it. So what Bayh-Dole says is our emphasis is we want to make sure we want to give the incentives and authorities for commercialization, but we also want to make sure people are making good faith efforts to use it. Because back in 1980, universities were not skilled in licensing inventions, which is a profession. So the concern was, well, maybe you can get a dominant company to license a university invention, not to commercialize it, but to suppress it. Suppose you're a buggy whip maker and suddenly somebody has an idea for a model for it. Well, maybe you're licensing it to make sure it never comes out. So what we said was...
Hold on, Joe. The irony is literally the buggy whip example I used on the radio today talking about something else. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Great minds work on the same channels. Yeah. So and not to disparage buggy whip people, but
yes.
So basically what Bayh-Dole said was, okay, we're going to give incentives, we're going to give authorities for universities and small companies to commercialize inventions, but we want to make sure you're making a good faith effort to do it. So there's 4 provisions there, very specific, where the government can march in to force the university to license another person. The first one is to make sure it's being brought to practical application. In other words, you're actually trying to commercialize it. Now, that only applies to the university. because we want to make sure universities are licensing on reasonable terms. What does that mean? What it means is, okay, you can't require a company to hire your daughter as a CEO. You can't you can't require a company to build you a new football stadium. So those are unreasonable terms. The other three apply to the university and the licensee. The licensee is the company actually making the development. And those say, okay, first of all, we gave a preference if you're going to make the product in the U.S. Bayh-Dole is one of the first U.S. manufacturing statutes ever written. The second one and third one are to make sure you can meet public health and safety needs. In other words, you can produce enough product to meet a COVID pandemic, for example. Okay, those are the four specific application, four triggers. As you said, so for 20 years, no one questioned that. And the other thing was march-in rights have only been used, it's only been 2 cases under 40 years where they actually have those circumstances came up. The reason march-in rights have not been used is very simple. Universities are managing their licenses. Right. If a company is missing milestones, if a company's not developing a product, they pull the license. So the government doesn't have to march in. So march-in rights is like the airbag on your car. I've been driving a long time. I've never had my airbag deployed. Does that mean airbags are useless? No. If I have a catastrophic accident, I want to make sure it's there, but you're hoping you never use it.
And it also means you don't want to have airbags deployed just because someone thinks that something's going to happen. You shouldn't have an ejector button in your car. Boom! I want to. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Right. It's Tuesday, so your airbag deploys. Okay. So anyway, as you were saying before, so for 20 years, no one questioned that. And actually, let me divert for 1 second. Please. There actually has been a case with Genzyme, who was a company that was making an orphan drug. Genzyme had a quality control issue in their New Jersey facility, so they had to shut down. So a march-in petition was filed to National Institutes of Health because they funded the research. So clearly you're not meeting health and safety needs. You can't produce the product because it's obviously you have a quality control issue. So what NIH looked at the issue and they said, okay, do we want to license a copier, which is going to have to go through Food and Drug Administration approval, or can Genzyme get back on their feet? Genzyme was able to re-import to the U.S. some drugs that could meet the patient's needs in the short term, and they got back in production in 6 months. So NIH rejected the petition. Now, if they had accepted the petition, patients would have been out of their medication, not for 6 months, but for years, because it would have taken years to the FDA to approve somebody. So that's how march-in rights work. So they've actually been very successful. But 20 years after Bayh-Dole, again, the people that don't like Bayh-Dole, that want to return us to the former policies, said they discovered a secret meaning in the law. If you ever read the Da Vinci Code, okay, it's like the Da Vinci Code.
I always love it when you read it and you say it's like the folks who are constantly reading Nostradamus' quatrains, and they're like, "Oh my God, he said a guy was born in the south of France. Well, that's got to be Popeye the Sailor." He's talking about. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, literally, one of the people that we work with on Bayh-Dole sent me it's like a 30-page long discourse, and I literally laughed at it because I was a Senate staffer, and so what they're quoting are other non-Bayh-Dole hearings or other anti-patent hearings, trying to say that the government has the right to march in if somebody doesn't like the price of a product.
Right.
And when they quoted our hearings, and again, I staffed our hearings. I wrote the Senate Judiciary Committee report. They took 2 sentences out of my report, put them together that were never combined that way to imply that we meant price control. So I just laughed at it. But then a couple months later, the Washington Post gives him an op-ed, and it's called "Paying Twice for the Same Drugs." So, and again, I had worked for Birch Bayh for 20 years. So I called Senator Bayh up, and I said, "Hey, Senator, this is serious. I mean, these people are misrepresenting your statute." He immediately understood. He said, "I'm going to call Bob." He called Bob Dole. Dole is also out. So Bayh and Dole immediately wrote a rebuttal to the Washington Post, saying that's not the way our law works. But nevertheless, a series of petitions have been filed under the theory that Bayh-Dole means price control. Every one has been rejected from Republican and Democratic administrations, including the Biden administration. But now, and Bayh and Dole,
hold on. Joe, let me just interrupt for a second, because it hinges on, at least as clear as I can understand this, the theory hinges on the concept of reasonable terms. They are reinterpreting the phrase reasonable terms, which is about the relationship between the discoverer and the licensee. and not about the relationship between the licensee and the general public. They're saying that reasonable terms means price control, which is, again, not what it was ever intended. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
No, that's exactly right. That's a critical point.
Yeah.
Reasonable terms in the law only applies to the university, not the licensee. And the reason is to make sure universities are putting reasonable terms in the license. They said, okay, well, reasonable terms means reasonable pricing.
Right.
And that's what Bayh and Dole have rebutted. So they can't really refute what Bayh and Dole said, because let me divert another second.
Please go ahead.
The Bayh-Dole coalition, because we said, listen, these people are trying to rewrite history. We have a thing called the digital library on our website that anyone can look at for free. It goes back to the end of World War II and has the original documents, including every march and petition, every decision by an agency, the history of Bayh-Dole. We even put up the critics' own law review article, so you can read it for yourself. And if you read that, it's really clear that price control was never in Bayh-Dole, ever, including the Biden administration rejected it. So this is a theory that's made out of thin air. The other thing they did was, then when they couldn't refute Bayh and Dole, they said, well, you shouldn't listen to Bayh and Dole because they waited 20 years to rebut this, and their law firms were working with drug companies. Well, the reason we waited 20 years was it took you 20 years to come up with this theory. And again, it was no nefarious drug company that got a hold of Birch Bayh. It was me, his former staffer, who called him, and Bayh did this for free. So, the whole thing.
And you did it because it's you are passionate about this. You are the staffer behind this. This is why I love talking to you about this, Joe, because, we always love sitting down with the person who, for which this was the start. I mean, obviously, not to take anything away from Senator Dole and Senator Bayh, but, you're the guy who had the idea to go and do this. And so you're the guy who's keeping tabs of this. And it's like, you see something like this. I'm like, I was there in the room. I know, right. What was it? The line from the musical Hamilton, the room where it happens. I was in the room where it happened. This is not how this works. And it's vital. And you understood the threat there. Let me ask you this, because you've done so much work in the intellectual property world. What is up with, this is a general question, it's a very Larry King-like, hey, what is it about this? What is it about the anti-intellectual property rights crowd? I mean, I've seen this, hold on, let me explain for a second. I spent many years on the real property rights side of things. So, and when I say real, folks, I mean land property rights,
Right.
And this issue of, we know that the Fifth Amendment's property rights codicils have been eroded over time, right? No private property should not be taken without due process. Anyway, I'm going to say it. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And we know that all of those terms have been watered down over the years to the point where, for instance, under the Kelo decision, public benefit is now equals public use. That's the same way that they're going with this, is to try to redefine these terms. But these words have meanings. Not that I was ever in the room when the Constitution, when the Fifth Amendment was being written, but I also see how it's being eroded. 20 years, they marched this down the field, no success with these petitions. A presidential candidate in 2019, we won't name this person, talks about seizing patents in the name of price controls. Then in 2023, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, they put out a policy proposal for public comment on this. How did we get from rejected over these many years to NIST doing this?
Well, that's mind-boggling, to tell you the truth. Yeah. And again, to back up our story,
Please.
I'm old enough now that when I came on Judiciary Committee, one of the reasons the U.S. was in a tailspin in the 70s and 80s was intellectual property and patent rights were anathema. If you look at the Justice Department spent their time, saying that the patents were basically antitrust problems. When I first got on the Senate Judiciary Committee, patents fell under the Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee. So you can imagine how they fared there. And the theory was that patents made things more expensive. And again, it's the same theory we had before Bayh-Dole. If technologies were just out there, magically, people would just commercialize them and everything would be cheaper.
Right.
And the people behind this actually sincerely, it's like a religious belief. They really believe that. They don't like patents, and they're particularly focused on drugs, which we can get into that in a minute. But their
Please.
alternative model, the alternative model they're really getting when you say, okay, what is it you really want? They want the government developing drugs. The way that their theory works is they talk about putting a barrier between markets and research. In other words, you're doing the research without any concern about markets. So what you'd have in essence, you'd have a government committee that decides which drugs you want to develop. And then they would put out grants for companies to bid on that you would do the work and then the government would own that and turn it into a new drug. So if that sounds like a good idea to you, you may wonder why the U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that even makes drugs. There's not a socialist country that even makes drugs. But that's a theory. And again, these are people driven by theory. They hate Bayh-Dole because Bayh-Dole's work in the cold, hard light of day. These are academic theorists. So anyway, back to your story. They filed, I think we've had maybe 10 march-in petitions in the last 30 years. About 8 of them have been filed for the same drug, a drug called Xtandi, Xtandi, which is a prostate cancer drug at the University of California. That has been rejected. Actually, the Obama administration rejected, I think, 4 times. The Trump administration rejected it, but they keep filing the same petition. And the Biden administration last year rejected it. But when they rejected it, you had people on Capitol Hill like Bernie Sanders and Senator Warren, who are backing the anti-Bayh-Dole theory, went crazy. So as a I think a political sop to them, the Biden administration said, okay, we're turning down the most recent petition, but we're going to have this interagency group look at march-in rights and consider whether price is a factor. Now, they just said it wasn't a factor. So they issued in fact, if you look on our website, you'll find the ruling from the Biden administration, like every other one, said Xtandi's been commercialized. They've met their obligation. There's nothing to march in about. It's a commercialized drug. It's out there. You can buy it. So anyway, this interagency group, and actually I used to chair the interagency group when I was at Commerce. We're working for like 6 months, behind the scenes. And this is my speculation. I think they got a call from somebody in the White House who said, hey, you will put price control in your final document. Yeah. So this has been pending now for 8 months. So if you look at it, it's like a passive aggressive document. You can see the bureaucracy didn't really want to do this because some of the document actually contradicts it. And in the middle, in the middle of it, suddenly price controls comes up again, which again is not in the statute. It's just been rejected by the Biden administration, but that's pending. So if this rule goes into place, it would undo the 44-year history of Bayh-Dole. The other thing is it's retroactive. So this is not if you commercialize something in the future. If you've already got something in the market, anybody can say, hey, I don't like Andrew's price. It's not reasonable. Sure. There's no definition of that. So Honeycrisp apples cost more than other apples in Kroger's. So I don't think that's reasonable. I'm going to ask the Department of Agriculture to march in so other people can copy Honeycrisp apples. So how would that be determined? Well, you would go to the bureaucracy and you'd have some GS-14, have a petition. Somebody comes in, anybody can file a march-in petition. And so you'd have a hearing. And if some GS-14 thought that Honeycrisp apples are not reasonably priced, then they could try to force the university to license somebody else. So you can appeal that. But that would turn the whole system on its head. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier was the key of Bayh-Dole is we decentralize technology out of Washington to universities. Now that would re-centralize the whole thing, which is another goal of the critics of Bayh-Dole. Now the bureaucracy arbitrarily can say, again, it's not drug prices, it's anything under Bayh-Dole, anything that's commercialized, even the guy's water filter. You could say, well, you're charging $29 in Bangladesh, and we can have a copier make it for $15. So we're going to take it away from you and let somebody license it for $15. Who would ever commercialize a technology? Because the copier can always make it cheaper than you did. You've shown them how it works. You've shown them there's a market. You've shown them how to make it. They don't have any of those costs. Right. So this is a huge. And
we already know for pharmaceuticals, there's already a period of exclusivity. This throws the concept of the period of exclusivity out the window. Let me ask you this though, and this is I don't know the answer, and it's always dangerous to ask a question I don't already know the answer to. Why Xtandi? Why is that the one that they keep petitioning over?
That's a great question. Because, this whole claim has been for 30 years now that march-in rights will lower drug prices. So you've had a number of studies done looking at that theory. Yeah. What they found is, no, it won't. And for a simple reason. Most drugs have multiple patents around them. Maybe 1 or 2 are funded by the federal government. So even if you marched in, you couldn't copy them. However, an exception is Xtandi. Xtandi does have their key patents made by the University of California. So that's why they keep filing the same. Now, it's been rejected 6 times.
Yes.
And that's why they keep filing it, because it's one of the few drugs that actually could be subject to margin rights. But the whole theory has fallen apart now. So now they come up with they're never wrong. They come up with a new theory. The new theory is, okay, well, now the government should use its authorities under Section 1498 to just take your private funded patents. So that's a whole other debate. That's not the way the statute works. But again, these people are never wrong. They just go further. Okay, our last theory didn't work. We've been telling this for 20 years. Yeah. Here's a new theory.
Joe, let me ask you this, because I want to come back to the multiple patents and the other technologies. But who benefits? And the reason why I ask this is because you peel back, and I'm not someone who believes that, that funding sources determine outcomes. But when I read that the German government, for instance, is funding organizations that are pushing for the undermining of the U.S. patent system, or I look at folks for whom they benefit when the U.S. economy or when economies topple over, and folks can sort of swoop in and produce goods for much less that have been stolen from other people, I get a little nervous. Who benefits from the invocation of marching over price controls?
That is another great question. And I think again, as you mentioned, this put out this marching proposal for public comments. Mm-hmm. So most of the public comments were cookie cutter comments from the other side, like 23,000 words. We want lower drugs. Yes, we support it.
Right, sure, absolutely.
However, venture capitalists and other people, but the most surprising comment from anyone was the generic drug industry, because that's who you would think would benefit from margin rights, because they would be the copiers. But here's what happened. The generic drug industry said, no, this is a disaster. We have costs too. So, again, the second or third copier would actually benefit from the first copier. So even the generic drug industry is opposed to this margin rights thing. So to answer your question, this is one of the few issues I've seen where actually no one would really benefit other than the theorists. When you look in real life, it would not lower drug prices. Even they're admitting that now. It would have a huge impact outside of drugs, because now energy, environment, agriculture, those patents are more likely to be federally funded. So in one fell swoop, you'd knock the props out of the whole U.S. innovation system. You would clobber small business startups. No venture capitalists would ever fund this. And back to your question, who benefits? You're back to where we were before 1980, where these inventions are now just lying in the public domain. I mean, China would benefit because we're publishing all these things, just like Japan benefited before Bayh-Dole. But there really would be no beneficiary, and that's what makes it so tragic. And I think that's the reason why the Biden administration has not finalized this rule. I think now they're hearing from people that they were surprised to hear from, and it could still happen, but it was a political soundbite to say, hey, we're going to do something on drug pricing. Now that's been proven that's not true. So I'm really hoping this thing is just going to die on the vine.
Listen, when you get a stalwart staffer from one of the most stalwart liberal Democratic senators, and I don't mean that in a bad way, coming out against it, when you have President Obama's, the head of his patent and trademark office, coming out against something alongside the head of Donald Trump's patent and trademark director, there's something wrong there. Let me sort of shift gears a little bit, because there's something else that's really fascinating in your bio, and you were there at the creation of the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and that is really interesting to me, because the way that our branches of government function, the way that the different courts function, the roles that they play. Talk about the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, how that was created, why it was created, your role, et cetera.
Well, that's another interesting thing. There was I mentioned it in the beginning. There were actually 3 things that revolutionized U.S. innovation, and they all happened almost at the same time, all within 2 years of each other. The first one was the Chakrabarty decision, which actually came out before Bayh-Dole. And again, remember, biotech was just in its infancy. We had people concerned about killer tomatoes. What's going to happen with this new technology? So anyway, and the patent office was not issuing issuing any inventions under biotech because they
Sure.
really weren't sure what to do. So the Supreme Court ruled in Chakrabarty v. Diamond that man-made organisms were patentable. Okay,
Sure.
so then Bayh-Dole came out. The basic biotech process came out of the University of California and Stanford. And that's what gave the U.S. a jump start in biotechnology. We were number 3 before then. We've become number 1 and remain that way. But the other thing that was mentioned was still a problem. I mentioned before we had an anti-patent regime before Bayh-Dole. So what happened was, in essence, every federal circuit had developed its own standards of patentability. If you want to have a U.S. patent thrown out, you went to the Ninth Circuit. If you want to have it affirmed, you went to the Fifth Circuit. So what happened was companies were like, who can rely on the system? I mean, is a patent good or not? So Judge Markey, bless his soul, was one of the people who looked at that system and said, hey, listen, this is crazy. So we worked on a thing called the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Again, at that time,
Wow.
The Supreme Court was not taking many patent cases, which may have been a blessing. But
Sure.
but the Court of Appeals of the Federal Circuit was a specialized court to standardize patentability across all the federal circuits. So you were no longer going to have, different circuits come up with their own standards. There's going to be one standard. And it was a combination of Bayh-Dole, Chakrabarty, and the Court of Appeals of the Federal Circuit, which lit the fuse on American innovation. And we blew the Japanese out of the water. We blew the Germans out of the water. Nothing like that has ever happened before. And again, it's driven by small companies. That's what makes us different. So if you take those pillars out, we're having problems now on the patent law. You've had the American Invents Act, which I thought was a huge mistake. Yeah. But now you're back again to people questioning, what's the value of the U.S. patent? We have all these post-grant procedures. And, the thought was Congress said, well, litigation is really expensive. We'll give people an alternative. Well, what's happened now is that's become an addition to litigation.
Right.
So now a big company can say, hey, small guy, I can take you back to these post-grant procedures. How long can you afford to do that? It's very much like the big 3 automakers before in the 70s when they told the guy who made the intermittent windshield wiper, hey, we're gonna infringe on your patent. What are you going to do about it?
What are you going to do about it? Sure.
And so that's the system we're going back to. But, again, once you undermine confidence in people that I'm going to take a risk and I can protect my investment. Right. And again, private property is the foundation stone of the U.S. government. The patent system is in Article 1, Section 8, even before the Bill of Rights. Right. So once you question that and say, okay, well, I don't like your price you're charging us something, or maybe your patent's not really that good, or maybe I can just keep putting you through these bureaucratic reviews. Then you undermined what makes us the most innovative country in the history of the world, and that's no small thing. I mean, there's not many countries in the world that are really driving innovation, and we are far and away doing it, but we're ignoring what made us great.
And let's hold on for a second, because we talked about this, and I'm cognizant of the time here, but we talk about China. And I used to say, the way that China would do it was they would, they steal our inventions and they make them with slave labor. China is trying to institute their own version of Bayh-Dole. Now, it's interesting because it's a communist nation still. It's a Maoist nation. But talk about what China's trying to do and how this presents a real threat, especially in light of us moving away from intellectual property rights protection.
Well, again, it's interesting because China's playing for real. Japan was an economic rival. They were not a military rival.
Right.
So China's a whole different ballgame, but they're very pragmatic. So what they're doing is they already figured they've beaten us in manufacturing, and we're trying to get that back. But the other thing they're doing is they've really studied the U.S. Bayh-Dole model.
Yeah.
So they're pouring billions and billions of dollars into their own universities. They're trying to pass us in basic research. They actually implemented a Bayh-Dole Act. And, again, whether this is going to work at a communist regime is a different thing. But they are, they have a lot of scientists have studied over here. They've looked at our model. But well, maybe it's not that much different. To me, the flaw in the Chinese system is it can change on a dime. Yeah. If you look at what Xi Jinping did, one of the first people just like Vladimir Putin, one of the first people he cracked down on was entrepreneurs who got too big for their britches. Right. So under the Chinese system, you have laws that say you can own something, but as soon as this Communist Party says, "Hey, you're too big for your britches," or "We want to nationalize that," again, the Chinese company, you're going to have members of the Chinese Communist Party on your board, whether you want them or not. Right. So To me, philosophically, I really don't know if you could have innovation when you really can't have political freedom. Now,
Right.
they're certainly giving that a try, but they have recognized that Bayh-Dole works. They've recognized there's something for patents and there's something for entrepreneurs
Sure.
there, but it's a different model. But again, if you look at what we've done with our own system, we could become just as arbitrary. I mean, if this march and petition goes through, how much different are we than the Chinese? Remember, anybody can file a march and petition. So if you've commercialized something, you spend 20 years of your life at it. Anybody, a rival, a Chinese company, somebody who just wants to shake you down, goes to the Department of Energy and says, I don't like your price. And the other thing is, under the march-in guidelines, under the statute, there's no definition of that. It's completely arbitrary. So any copier can always undercut you in pricing. So
100%.
Again, we may not be that much different than China if we go down this road. And, again, if that system worked, Venezuela would be the most innovative country in the world, where the government can just take whatever you want, whenever they want. And, once you head down that road, you've killed innovation. No one is stupid enough to spend their time and money on something where arbitrarily can just be taken away from them.
100%. It's the reasonable investment-backed expectations on the real property side of these things. You have to have that incentivization. Joe, because we never quite got to this. So how did you get to the Hill? Where'd you grow up? How'd you get up there?
Oh, that's a whole nother 40 minutes. I was a 60s kid, kind of bouncing around. I got a job in the Senate mailroom working nights.
That's awesome.
I was able to get a lowest level job you could have doing research. And God bless him, Birch Bayh. I was actually working for a senator called John Tunney. If you ever look at the movie that Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford made called The Candidate, it was about John Tunney, Gene Tunney's son, and he lost. So Birch Bayh inherited me, and for whatever reason, they like me. I don't know why, but they did, and they gave me a shot. They didn't have to. I'm not from Indiana, but I would have walked through a wall for Birch Bayh.
Where'd you grow up?
Falls Church, Virginia.
Is that right?
Absolutely, Falls Church Jaguar.
And where'd you go to college?
Oh, geez, I went to college in the '60s, so but that's a whole nother story. I went to a number of different places.
Okay, got it. Yes, you majored in the '60s. I understand.
I majored in the '60s, and despite that, my poor parents despaired of me. But I finally found a school where I could get out without learning a foreign language. So that's where I would still be here.
That's so funny. Did you ever? William and Mary wasn't one of those schools, was it?
No. I went to Ole Miss. I went to LSU. I mean, I went all over the place.
That's and you wind up working for a northern Midwestern senator. And I ask because I have family from Indiana, so I know my grandmother got Wester Soul would have wanted me to ask about that. And so I always ask this of my guests because I think it's important to humanize the folks who are doing this kind of work. And I didn't tee this up for you, and I probably should have earlier. I always ask my guests about their outside interests. When you're not doing work on this, what are you doing? How do you spend your free time, if you have any free time?
We live out in the country now, so I'm a runner. I spend a lot of time with our local animal shelter. Nice. My wife and I are crazy enough that we actually bought our house far enough off the road where all our animals could be safe.
Nice.
So that's what I spend my time doing. Is I've got 14. I went from Falls Church, and I got 14 acres. So I spend a lot of time on my tractor mowing grass.
Nice.
So anyway, I do something completely different. I couldn't do this all the time, but
no, you have to.
You do. But the other thing is, this is critical. This is not a small thing, and that's why, just like we talked about the scientists said, I just can't give it up.
Yeah.
If we lose this, it's catastrophic. And back to what you said earlier, no one really benefits. That's a tragedy. No one really benefits from this. So it's one of those crazy things you're thinking, who in their right mind is suggesting this? We've run the experiment. We know it doesn't work. The NIH actually had price control in the early 90s. It was forced on them. So what happened? Was that the golden age of cheap drugs? No, companies walked away. And Harold Varmus, the then NIH director, said, this policy has done no public good. All it's done is present important public and private sector partnerships. And ever since then, NIH has been rock solid on these partnerships, but they would dissolve overnight. Right. So that's what worries me. If you get this wrong once, it's catastrophic.
And very, very difficult to undo, as you and I both know, years in public policy. How do folks find out more about the good work you're doing at the Bayh-Dole Coalition?
Go to our website. It's BAYHDOLE Coalition, a long word, but one word, .org. It's all free. As I said, you can look at our digital library. We have a number of things there. even God bless him, we had Senator Dole on the 40th anniversary of
Nice.
Bayh-Dole when he was just before he died, gave a great testimony to his friend Birch Bayh. Now, again, Bayh and Dole were on different sides of the mile,
Right.
but they really respected each other. And to have Senator Dole at 96 years old, shortly before he passed away, he was determined that he was going to record what he thought of his friend Birch Bayh.
That's amazing. That is amazing. Well, listen, Joe Allen, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
That was Joe Allen. He is the executive director of the Bayh-Dole Coalition. And this brings us to the close of yet another episode of The Lunch Hour. If you're watching us on YouTube, check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, check out our YouTube page. Please subscribe, leave a review, and let everybody you know how much you're enjoying The Lunch Hour. I've been your host, Andrew Langer, and please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.